بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back to a new lecture. Alhamdulillah, in the last lecture we were able to enter into the chapter of prayer, and we spent the entire class in the three clips talking about the different times of prayer and learning the beginning and the ends, etc., etc. So now we're going to move from that, and we're going to start talking about the obligation, the things that make the prayer an obligation. In order to understand that, we are going to have a small discussion on the definition of taklif, on the definition of moral responsibility. What makes us as people that have a rational faculty, with our intact, hear and understand the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you can hear and understand the type of sentences that we're using, that means that you are a rationally upright person. That means you have moral responsibility to act on certain things and not act on certain things. So even though the definition of taklif is something that will carry throughout the book, throughout the chapters of Islamic law, because this is the first introduction, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the definition and breaking it down into some parts. Following that, we will take a small journey into the recommended prayers. What are the sunnah prayers? The different categories of sunnah prayers. Some of those will be the prayers al-qabliyya wal-ba'diyya, the prayers before the fard, the sunnahs before the fard and after the fard. But there are other types of sunnah prayers throughout the day, like tahajjud, taraweeh, the rain prayer, eclipse prayer, etc., which many of those prayers will be in the later part of this chapter, the chapter of prayer in the book. They'll be discussed, and it's important to understand and to list them. This will not be an exhaustive list, but it will introduce the different types of prayers that we have. Those extra prayers will be categorized in different categories. The first category will be those that are recommended, and those are usually the ones that happen with certain events. After that, there will be the prayers al-rawatib that circumambulate or kind of revolve around the 5 daily prayers. Those are what I said, the qabliyya and the ba'diyya. And then there are the type of prayers that are called nawafil, or extra sunnah prayers, meaning that these are things that the Prophet ﷺ did and didn't do, but not with the kind of frequency as some of the other prayers, and we'll talk about those. And this is a nice framework to help put in our minds the different types of extra prayers. After that, we will begin the discussion of the prerequisites for the prayer. There are things that we have to have within ourselves before we start to pray. We won't finish that discussion. We will end by beginning that discussion, and in the next lecture, inshallah, we'll continue that discussion, inshallah. So let us begin by reading with the Arabic text of the Matn of Abi Shuja'. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في شروط وجوبها. وشرائط وجوب الصلاة 3 أشياء: الإسلام والبلوغ والعقل، وهو حد التكليف. فصل في الصلوات المسنونة والرواتب. الصلوات المسنونة 5: العيدان والكسوفان والاستسقاء، والسنن التابعة للفرائض 17 ركعة: ركعة الفجر، و4 قبل الظهر وركعتان بعده، و4 قبل العصر وركعتان بعد المغرب، و3 بعد العشاء يوتر ب1 منهن، و3 نوافل مؤكدات: صلاة الليل وصلاة الضحى وصلاة التراويح. فصل في شروط الصلاة وشرائط الصلاة قبل الدخول فيها 5 أشياء: طهارة الأعضاء من الحدث والنجس، وستر العورة بلباس طاهر. This is about the sections that we will take in today's class. Now, let us turn, as is our habit, to go over the English. Conditions obligating the prayer. There are 3 conditions that obligate the prayer. One must pray if one is a Muslim. mature, and of sound mind. The combination of these three conditions is the definition of legal responsibility, taklif. Recommended prayers. There are 5 recommended prayers. The 2 Eid prayers, the solar and lunar eclipse prayers, and the rain prayer. There are 17 prayer rakats, cycles of recommended prayers associated with the obligatory daily 5 prayers. 2 before Fajr, 4 before Dhuhr and 2 after Dhuhr, 4 before the mid-afternoon prayer, 2 after the sunset prayer, meaning Maghrib, 3 after the night prayer, 1 single prayer cycle which is Witr. And there are 3 supererogatory prayers that are emphasized: the night vigil prayer, Qiyamul Layl, the mid-morning prayer, Salatul Duha, and Taraweeh that we pray in Ramadan. There are 5 prerequisites for prayer: the absence of ritual impurity and inexcusable filth, and covering one's nakedness with clothes that are pure. And I think that's as far as that we're going to get. Now, in the discussion, when I'm going to go through it, inshallah, guided by the Hashia, we will come across some of the adillah for the prayer, so I'm going to do that as we go rather than reading from the book of the Dalil. Okay, now the first thing, he talks about the conditions for taklif. In the book of Abi Shuja' radiallahu anhu, he gives us 3 conditions for taklif. Those are the broad conditions. But if we come and splice them and look at their details, there are actually 6. So let me give you the 3 that he doesn't mention and then segue into the 3 that he mentions. The first is that one has to be free from the type of bloods that we have mentioned before that are specific to women, meaning the monthly cycle, menstrual cycle, the monthly menstrual cycle, al-hayd, the postnatal bleeding, and nifas. Because when the prayer time comes for those women in that state, there is no taklif for them. Remember, we said it's impermissible for them to pray. And at the same time, there is no make-up prayer. This might sound like a technical academic thing, but it is a technical academic definition, so it's important that we know it. So the first thing of taklif vis-a-vis prayer is that a woman does not fall in those categories. Number 2, which is more broad, is that a person has all of their senses intact. If a person were blind and deaf at the same time, even though they were intelligent, the Sharia would say that this person is not a person of taklif. So in the English-speaking world, a famous example is somebody like Helen Keller, who even though she got an advanced degree and she was a published author and she gave lectures through sign and things like that, but because of her inability to see and to speak and hear at the same time, the Sharia would render such a person not a mukallaf. Of course, if that person chose to believe and follow the guidelines of Islam, they'll be rewarded for that, of course. But there is something about being able to see and to hear, to have both of those faculties and your other senses at the same time, that enters you into the speech or the direction of the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then number 3 is that somebody has had to have received the da'wah of Islam. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We do not punish a people unless we send a messenger. So according to this verse and the dominant position or in the position of Sunni Islam for the schools of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, if a person does not receive the message of Islam, does not understand the message of Islam, then they have not been given the message for them to have taklif built on it. So number 1 is that of the 3 that are not mentioned in the book is the technical things that we're talking about. A woman who is not in any of the bloods that a woman experiences that preclude her from taklif. Number 2, a person has all of their senses intact properly. And number 3, that they have received the message. Then after that comes the 3 that we have mentioned in the book, being that the person is a Muslim. So When Allah Ta'ala says, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ, establish the prayer, this is something that is specific for Muslims, people who believe. The prayer is considered from the furu'a of the religion, the branches of the religion. The usul of the religion is to believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. So people who do not believe, people who are not Muslim, their obligation is to accept the da'wah if and when they receive it first. Then they can proceed to the furu'a. That's why the first thing he says is that this is for a Muslim. So in other words, if we just use layman's terms, if you're not a Muslim, you have bigger things that you need to preoccupy yourself with, which is understanding and accepting the message first, then you can pray. That's why he says the first thing of taklif in his list, after the three that I gave you, is Islam. And then number two is that they are mature. That they are mature. Now, maturity is established in the Sharia with the first experience of the sexual organ. In other words, when a young boy has a wet dream and when a young girl has her monthly cycle, these are a new thing, a new physical thing that has been introduced to their body that was not there before. And with this comes this taklif, comes this moral responsibility of, oh, I have this new capacity in my body that I did not know about. And therefore Allah Ta'ala has made that moment the moment of taklif, because it is a moment in which one moves from this age of pure innocence to now an age in which they have to protect themselves from certain things. Plus they need to learn the fiqh of the different things. So our children, we have an obligation to teach them how to wash and how to clean themselves when it comes to these things. So this is the age of bulugh. And then he says you have to be of sound mind, al-aql, which is a little bit different than the senses. Sound mind means that you are rational, your mind is, for example, you are not drunk or intoxicated, you are not high on drugs, you are not sleeping, you are not insane. Those are things in which your mind, your rational faculty is not 100% together, obviously. Some of those states are temporary, and some of those states can be long-term or permanent, God forbid. So, in addition to the things that we mentioned in the small list, specifically in the book, maturity and of sound mind, then the person has to be of sound mind, because the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that comes, do and don't do. This is what al-hukm al-shar'i is. When we come to study usul al-fiqh together, we will spend a lot of time defining what does that mean, Allah's speech. But the Quran is like Allah's speech coming to something. Who is it coming to? It's coming to the person who is of sound mind, who is mature, who has believed. This is what taklif is. So therefore, if a person is temporary out of their mind, there is no taklif. And a very common example is when a person sleeps, and this creates many interesting sub-scenarios within the Sharia that we can talk about when they are appropriate, inshallah. So these 6 points, the 3 that I introduced, which come from the Hashiyah of Imam al-Bajuri, by the way, they're not from Tariq, they're from the Hashiyah, plus the 3 that are in the book, this is the definition of a taklif, which I like to translate as a morally responsible person. So he spends a little bit of extra time talking about this here, because this is something that will, as I said, we will have throughout the books of fiqh. Okay, then he moves and he talks about the 5 prayers, the first group of prayers, which are the salawat al-masnuna. These are the prayers that the Prophet ﷺ used to do and would rarely leave. And I like to think of them as prayers that take place with certain events. So he begins, there are 5 of them. 2 of them are pairs, so the list is only 3. So the first are the 2 Eids, Eid al-Fitr in chronological order, and Eid al-Adha, even though Eid al-Adha is considered the greater of the Eids because it's a longer, there are the 3 days after it. Eid al-Fitr is the day after the last day of Ramadan, So it is the first day of Shawwal, day 1 of Shawwal, that's Eid al-Fitr. And there's an Eid prayer that takes place after the sun rises, all the way until before Salat al-Dhuhr. In the Shafi'i madhab, that's the time for the Eid prayer. We'll get to that in much more detail, so we don't need to do that now, but just the sketch of it. And the prayer has the prayer that we do, the multiple takbirat in each rak'ah. And of course, in the Eid prayer, the prayer is followed by a khutbah. So the Eid Salat Sunnah of the Eid prayer is separate from the khutbah. In other words, there are two separate acts. Unlike Salat al-Jum'ah, in which you have to have the khutbah and following the khutbah, the 2 rak'ahs. Theoretically, you could have just the Eid prayer, not the khutbah, even though, you wouldn't do that. But let's say you were traveling or you were stuck at home with bad weather or something like that. Like during COVID, this actually, we had a couple of Eids like this. We would pray the Eid at home, just, with the family, and there wouldn't necessarily be a khutbah after that. So the 2 Eids, followed by the 2 Kusuf and Khusuf prayer. The Kusuf prayer is for the solar eclipse, and the Khusuf prayer is for the lunar eclipse. Again, there is a special prayer. Each rak'ah has 2 ruku'ahs in it. We'll talk about that in detail. So it's a peculiar prayer, and there's a khutbah involved in that prayer as well. But the eclipse prayers are very long. So the sunnah is that the actual salah itself is supposed to last the duration of the eclipse itself. And as you know, the eclipse could be, quite quite a long time. So the 2 eclipse prayers are prayers that are very lengthy indeed. And then the rain prayer, al-istisqa. Istisqa, it means to ask for the rain. Istaf'ala is to ask for, in that form of the conjugation of the word. So the istisqa is that we are asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the rain to come. And again, the rain prayer is a very elaborate prayer that involves 3 days of fasting before. It involves wearing your simple clothes, not your nice clothes. The imam puts his clothes inside out. It's very elaborate. There's a khutbah, and then there's a prayer, etc. involved in it. So we'll have time to talk about that in the book when it comes to it. But these are the 5 Masnunat prayers. Okay. And then after that is the prayers, the sunnah prayers that we might be a little bit more familiar with, which are the prayers that revolve around the 5 daily prayers. In the book, he says that there are 17, but depending on your count, some people add 2. In his list, he says there's only 2 after Dhuhr, but some add 2 more, 4 after Dhuhr, and then we'll reduce with the Isha and just make it the Witr after Isha to keep the number of 17, or there are some that will say that there are 19, but we're just going to go with the counting in the book, excuse me, to not make things more complicated than they are. So he says, the first is the 2 rak'ahs before Salatul Fajr. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, as is narrated in Muslim, رَكْعَةَ الْفَجْرِ خَيْرٌ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَمَا فِيهَا, that the 2 rak'ahs that you pray sunnah before Fajr is more beloved and greater than the dunya and everything inside the dunya. Now, these is usually a short sunnah, so it's not a prayer in which there's a long recitation in the sunnah prayer. And then after the sunnah prayer, there's a sunnah before you stand for Fajr prayer to lie on your right side. And during lying on your right side, it can be a moment or it can be prolonged, but one of the hikmahs behind that is to remind yourself and to contemplate your own mortality and your own death, that you're like lying in the grave on your right side. So there are some people that you will see that maintain this sunnah, which is they would pray the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, like a light 2 rakahs, and then they will lie on the right side, and then they'll get up and they'll stand and they'll pray Salatul Fajr. So this is the first sunnah of the day. Following that are the sunnahs revolving around Dhuhr prayer. In the Matn of Abi Shuja, he says that there are 4 before Dhuhr and 2 afterwards. We have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that is narrated in Tirmidhi, that whoever maintains praying 4 rakahs before Dhuhr and 4 rakahs after Dhuhr, sunnah, حرم الله عليه النار. Allah Ta'ala will forbid the hellfire from touching them. So in this hadith and in the Hashiyah, this would be an advancement that there would be 4 rakahs also after Dhuhr, even though in the book he says that there's 4 before Dhuhr and 2 after Dhuhr. And then the reason is that there have different narrations, different traditions. And depending on how the fuqaha understood the strength of each one, they would hold to one over the other. But because this hadith is so powerful, I wanted to share it with you so that you also have that. Now, when it comes to the Dhuhr sunnahs, and I should have said this with Fajr, the time for the sunnah prayers is when the prayer fard has come in. So if you remember from the last class, when the fard time comes in, that's the time to do the sunnah before the fard prayer. Specifically when it comes to Jummah, specifically when it comes to Dhuhr, the question is, do you do the sunnahs during Jummah or not? And the answer is yes. So to maintain the rawatib sunnah of Dhuhr prayer on the day of Friday, you would also pray 4 before and then 2 or 4 after, and each of these are in 2 different cycles, 2 and 2. And then 4 before Asr, which is, I think a lot of people don't know that, but there's sunnah of 4 rakahs before Asr. The Prophet ﷺ said, as is narrated by Ibn Khuzaymah and Al-Hibban in their 2 Sahih collections, the hadith of Ibn Umar, that the Prophet ﷺ said, رحم الله امرأً صلى قبل العصر أربعًا. May Allah Ta'ala have mercy on the person who prays before Asr 4, meaning 2 and 2. Okay, so that's a pretty big endorsement. And then for us, there is no sunnah prayer after Asr prayer without a reason. So if you walk into the mosque after Asr, say you prayed at home Asr, and then you go to the mosque to pray Maghrib, but you found yourself in the mosque before Maghrib, when you walk in the mosque, do you pray the 2 greetings or not? In our madhab, you pray the 2 greetings because there's a reason that you're praying. Why? To greet the mosque. The prohibition of praying after Asr is Salah al-Mutlaqa, just to pray just for the sake of praying. So after Asr, there is no praying just for the sake of praying. But if there's a reason why, like in this case, greeting the mosque, that's a common example, you would still do that when you go to the mosque. But the sunnah for us for Asr is the 4 rakahs before Asr, then you pray 2 and 2, and then you pray Asr, and then there's nothing until the Maghrib prayer, which we'll pick up with on the next clip, inshallah. And then there's 2 rakahs after the Maghrib prayer. If you remember in our previous discussion on the times of prayer, we said that in the new opinion of the Madhab al-Jadid of Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, he said that the time for Maghrib was tight. It's enough just to make the adhan, make wudu, close yourself, make the aqama, and pray 5 rakahs, meaning the 3 of Maghrib and the 2 sunnahs that are here. And then we said, of course, that we're going to follow the old position, which the time is wider, but now you know why he said 5, is to include these 2 rakahs after Salatul Maghrib. Also we have in the 2 Sahih collection, in the 2 Sahihs, Bukhari and Muslim, the hadith of Anas, that he said the older people from the Sahaba, that they used to follow up their Maghrib prayer with the 2 rakahs sunnah. And then the way our book is framed here is that we have, after the Isha prayer, 3, 2 sunnah and 1 witr. Now, I wanted to see if there's a hadith about that. Okay, what does that mean? We know that it's a sunnah to end the day with a witr prayer. Witr means odd. The least amount of prayer that you can do to fulfill the witr is 1 rak'ah. So here, the sunnah is two units of prayer after the Isha, and then 1 prayer is witr. Of course, you can pray witr 3 rak'ahs, 5 rak'ahs, 7 rak'ahs, 9 rak'ahs, and you can keep going, in which you would basically pray 2, 2, 2, 2, and then end with 1. But here we're talking about the sunnahs that come in the hadith collections and what we found the Prophet ﷺ to have done frequently. So that's why it's 2 and then 1, and that 1 is the intention is that you are praying Salat al-Witr. And that is the last prayer of the day. Okay, and then he says that there are 3 types of nawafil that are emphasized prayers outside of the occasional prayers and outside of the rawatib sunnahs. The first one is Qiyamul Layl. And there's a great, spiritual benefit of Qiyamul Layl. One of the greatest hadiths that we have is the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha alayhi salam, that's in Bukhari and Muslim, in which she said that the Prophet alayhi salam did not increase or decrease, neither in Ramadan or outside of Ramadan, more than 11 rak'ahs in the evening. Meaning the 8 rak'ahs in cycles of 2, and then the witr being the 3 rak'ahs, 2 and then 1. This is an important hadith because this is where there's a lot of mistake that comes with Taraweeh, which we'll get to in a little bit, but just remember this hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ used to pray Qiyamul Layl, and this was one of his khasa'is, one of his special qualities is that he had to pray Qiyamul Layl, whereas for us it's a sunnah. The next type of nafilah is Salat al-Duha, which the correct number of rak'ahs for it, maximum number of rak'ahs for it, is 8. And Salat al-Duha is that you pray after the sun rises. Sorry, I was trying to find something. Okay. After the sun rises, before the zawal, before dhuhr time comes in. So remember in the previous lecture we talked about the 24-hour cycle of the prayers, and we said that there's a gap between when the sun rises and the zawal. That time gap when the sun rises and the zawal, that's the time for the sunnah of the duha prayer. The least amount can be 2 rak'ahs, and the maximum amount is 8 rak'ahs. I want to see if I have a hadith about that. I don't think I have one readily available. Let's just see, because it is a lot of reward involved in it. Duha. Abu Huraira narrates, as is in Bukhari, that he said that the Prophet ﷺ, or my beloved Khalili, my beloved, advised me to do 3 things: to fast 3 days during the month, to pray the duha prayer, and to pray Salat al-Witr before I sleep. So this is one of those like forgotten sunnahs, and it's a good thing to do. And the last thing is Taraweeh. Taraweeh, of course, is the sunnah that we pray in Ramadan, and the sunnah of Taraweeh in our madhab is 20 rak'ahs. Now, the Taraweeh, we just said that Sayyidah Aisha alayhi salam narrated that the Prophet ﷺ did not pray more than 11 rak'ahs in the evening, whether in Ramadan or outside of Ramadan. It's important that we need to remember that the Taraweeh sunnah comes from the time of the companions, specifically during the Khilafah of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Alaykum bi sunnati wa sunnati al-khulafa al-rashidin al-mahdiyyin min ba'di a'addu alayha bin nawajid." Follow my sunnah and follow the sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs after me. Hold and bite to them on to that sunnah with your wisdom teeth, all the way in the back of your mouth. That means you bite the whole thing and you hold on to it. So when the khulafa and the sahaba do something and act there is evidence for it, then it can become a sunnah for us. So when we say that the Taraweeh is a sunnah, it's a sunnah because we follow the sunnah of the Khulafa. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, he gathered the Sahaba together and they prayed 20 rakahs. Now, one of the miracles of the Quran is that as the Quran became printed much, much later in Islamic history, I mean, the printing of the Quran is recently, just a couple hundred years ago. The most popular way of printing the Quran is a Ottoman style way, such that each juz is 20 pages. And therefore, the fact that you have the Taraweeh has 20 rakahs, you can read one page each rakah, and therefore in each Taraweeh night finish one juz of the Quran. There's another sunnah of the Taraweeh that came from the people of Medina, that the Taraweeh of the people of Medina for the companions and the tabi'een there was 36 rakahs. And that's because in Mecca, after each 4 rakahs, the Sahaba would take a break and do tawaf 7 times. So the people of Medina said, well, we don't have something like that. So after every 4 rakahs, where the people, our brothers in Mecca, do the tawaf, we're going to pray another 4 rakahs. And that's why in the school of Medina, in the school of Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, the Taraweeh is 36 rakahs. And for the rest of us, the Taraweeh is 20 rakahs. And again, this takes place in the month of Ramadan. And when we come to talk about fasting, we will also learn that it is a sunnah starting on the eve of the 15th of Ramadan till the end of the month that you make dua in the qunut of the witr prayer. Okay, so this is the discussion of the nawafil. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to pick up from the hashiyah. There are other nafil prayers that he does not mention, but it's important that we can mention some of them, such as I made an allusion to the tahiyyat al-masjid. Tahiyyat al-masjid is to pray 2 rakahs when you go to the masjid. There's also salat al-istikhara. There's also salat at-tasabih, which is a great thing that you can do. You can find the details of that in Imam al-Nawawi's Adhkar. The details for the istikhara is also in Imam al-Nawawi's Adhkar. And there's also the sunnah of praying 2 rakahs after you make wudu, which comes from Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu anhu, and other ones that you'll find in the literature. The next section that we'll begin, but we won't finish, are the prerequisites. The 5 prerequisites, the shara'it of the salah. So before you pray, number 1 is you have to have the absence of ritual impurity and inexcusable filth, hadath. So that means you have to have wudu, and you can't have any filth on you, but you can have an inexcusable amount that we said would be a tiny portion, orfan, as defined by custom. That would be okay. So that's why we spent so much time talking about the wudu and hadath and all of that kind of stuff, because those are the things that we need to make sure that we don't have when we are praying. So number 1 is you yourself have to have raised the state of hadath by making wudu, or if you have major janaba, by making ghusl. And at the same time, on your body, on your person, you can't have any filth that would be considered inexcusable. So let's say you're walking and a couple of birds or pigeons poop on you, and there's a lot of that, that would have to be removed or washed. But if you had like a little bit of blood, you shaved or you nicked yourself for a paper cut and you have a little bit of blood, that would be an excusable amount. And then the rest of the prerequisites we'll talk about in tomorrow's lecture, inshallah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. So today's lecture, alhamdulillah, we took another step into the chapter of prayer. We began our discussion by learning a new concept, the concept of taklif, or moral responsibility. And even though the book that we're studying gives us 3, we added to those another 3 that we lifted from the hashiyah, just to make it a academically coherent argument to understand the full definitions of taklif. In the definition of taklif, of course, this brushes up against some theological issues about who's a believer, who's not a believer. Inshallah, when we come to talk about theology and aqidah, we can pick that discussion up. But for right now, for the purposes of fiqh, it's important that we understand that people have to have a certain set of prerequisites for the branches of the Sharia to be obligatory for them. They have to be of sound mind, they have to have their senses, they have to be able to understand, they have to be mature of age, and they have to be a Muslim for the branches of them to be obligatory. And even though we spent a little bit of time, we also mentioned that this is a definition of taklif that we will make reference to throughout the chapters of fiqh by simply saying taklif or mukallaf or something like that, and now we know what that's about. Following that, we looked at three chunks or three types of sunnah prayers. We looked at the masnunat, which I liken to occasional prayers, the two Eids, the two eclipse prayers, and the rain prayer. And each one of these will be discussed in the chapter of fiqh towards the end of the chapter in detail. And then we talked about the rawatib, the sunnah al-rawatib, which are the sunnah prayers that we pray before and after each fard prayer. And we said that the time for those sunnah prayers is when the time of the fard prayer comes in, and then there are some sunnahs that we do before, some sunnahs that we do after. In the most basic understanding of the Shafi'i madhab, there are 17. 2 before Fajr, 4 before Dhuhr, 2 after Dhuhr, 4 before Asr, 2 after Maghrib, 3 after Isha, 2, and then one single one, which is Salatul Witr. And then we talked about the Witr prayer and why that's important. And then we talked about another type of sunnah prayers, the nawafil, which are the night prayer that the Prophet ﷺ, as reported by Sayyidah Aisha ﷺ, used to pray 11 rak'ahs each night, inside Ramadan or outside Ramadan, 8 and then 3 for witr. And then he prayed Salat al-Duha, which takes place after the sun has risen, right before the zawal, right before Dhuhr prayer, the minimum being 2 rak'ahs, the maximum being 8, and Taraweeh in Ramadan. And we talked about the history of how we got the Taraweeh from the Sunnah of the Khulafa Rashidun. And then we began by the prerequisites of prayer, and we actually only were able to do one, which is making sure that we have an absence of hadath and inexcusable filth. And that will be the conclusion for today's class. Wallahu ta'ala wa a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.